Hi, my name's Michael Crawley. I'm an assistant professor at Durham University, 220 marathon runner and author of Out of Thin Air, Running Wisdom and Magic from Above the Clouds in Ethiopia. And you're listening to the Physical Performance Show.
Failure is not an option.
I've had my ups and my downs.
I think it's an absolutely breakthrough experience.
Welcome to the Physical Performance Show, the show designed to inspire the pursuit of your physical best performance. I'm your host, Brad Beer. Listen in as we delve into how the world's top physical performers achieve their success, as well as the highs, the lows, and the journey of getting there. Let's get ready, set, let's go. Welcome to the Physical Performance Show, brought to you by Earshot's Bluetooth headphones. Headphones for cyclists and runners who charge. Pogo Physio's online telehealth consultations, and of course our very own Learnings Physical Performance Show membership. I'm Brad Beer, sports physiotherapist and exercise scientist by trade and training, and founder of Pogo Physio. Each week, as you know, we'll bring you the latest and greatest information and inspiration designed to help you perform at your physical best. We do this through a range of our different episodes, interest editions, coaches' corners, expert editions, featured performers, and the occasional catch-up episode. And today you are in for a real treat, a gem of an episode featuring UK-based Assistant Professor in Social Anthropology, Dr. Mike Crawley. Now, we had a slight programming change as this week was due to be a deep dive into all things running surface interactions with former guests of the show, Dr. Max Paquette. However, Max was held up with some US Olympic trials work, so stay tuned for that episode coming. However, the episode you'll enjoy today is one I've been looking forwards to sharing with you and recording for many, many months. I had the pleasure of meeting today's guest at altitude in Ethiopia in February 2020, where Mike was taking part in a track session on a Abebe Bikila's track at 3,000 meters of elevation in Saluta. And I got chatting to Mike casually as one of the only non-East Africans there that morning. And Mike shared with me his professional work as an anthropologist and the fact that he was going to be releasing a book about all things the culture of Ethiopian running. And that Mike did. Late 2020, Mike's publication was out, titled Out of Thin Air, Running Wisdom and Magic from Above the Clouds in Ethiopia. Now, the great Haile Gebrselassie, Olympic gold medal winner and world champion and former world record holder for the marathon, had this to say about Mike's publication. Through reading this book, you'll come to understand that the heart and soul of running are to be found in Ethiopia. By way of bio, Mike Crawley is no slouch himself. He's a 220 marathoner who has competed internationally for Scotland and Great Britain. Mike is currently an assistant professor in social anthropology at Durham University. And in compiling Out of Thin Air, Mike spent 15 months in Addis Ababa and the surrounding regions of Ethiopia, integrating into the running lifestyle and ways of the Ethiopian running culture. It's a research method known as social ethnography, whereby the researchers' aims are to spend time with people participating and observing in order to explain their worldview. And during today's episode, you'll hear Dr. Mike Crawley share with you what he determined to be the heart and soul of Ethiopians' running culture. Mike shares the rich history and institutional support that was forged off the back of Abebe Bikila's heroic and historic 1960 barefoot victory on the streets of Rome at the 1960 Rome Olympic Games. At the time, that was the first gold medal won by a sub-Saharan African, and off the back of that, the running culture in Ethiopia has really ensued and flourished. Yet surprisingly, in the West, we know very little about the Ethiopian running culture. You'll hear Mike share furthermore today around how dreaming is still very much alive in Ethiopia, beliefs around running surfaces, running locations, rest and recovery, fueling, and the curious yet compelling habits of zigzagging when running, avoiding the road, and so much more. Now, if you're yet to read Out of Thin Air, then pop it on your to-read list. And I know after this episode with Dr. Mike Crawley and Dr. Mike's share-ins, you will be adding it to your must-read list. Here is my conversation with social anthropologist, assistant professor at Durham University, and of course, 220 Scottish representative runner himself, Dr. Mike Crawley, on all things running wisdom and magic from above the clouds in Ethiopia. Dr. Mike Crawley, author of Out of Thin Air, Running Wisdom and Magic from Above the Clouds in Ethiopia. Welcome to the Physical Performance Show.
Thank you very much. Long time since I saw you. I think the last time was standing by a track in Salta and I was seeing stars after a track session. Good to catch up when I can actually breathe.
That's right. It was it was February 2020, just before COVID really became a national talking point. International talking point. There were early signs of it, but in Ethiopia, felt relatively removed from those things. I did anyway, and I got home and it was all happening. But Mike, I won't forget that morning when I met you. It was at altitude there in Saluda, a track session, Kenanisa's track, and Zane, who I was over there assisting, former guest of the show, episode 203. Zane Robertson, he decided on the Sunday morning or maybe the Saturday night that he wasn't going to go and do a long run. Instead, he was going to go to a track session, but there was no plan to meet up with the group. And we arrived there at the track, and you were there with your team, and it was maybe 50 runners at that track session, right?
Yeah, it was. Yeah, it would have been. Yeah, it was an interesting session as well. It was, I think, 30 seconds reps on the track, so kind of almost like 200 meter reps, but just on the watch, running 30 seconds hard, 30 seconds easy. But I think we did that for an hour, so it was quite an epic sort of track session. And you did well. You kept up, and you're an elite runner yourself, 220 marathoner, unless you've now bettered that with all your Ethiopian. Sadly not.
No, 66 half marathoner. But Mike, one of my fondest memories is the drills, which we'll post up in the gallery, a little bit of video of that, of yourself, in amongst the Ethiopians. And it was really just one of the best things to observe is how mechanical and coordinated that drill line was. It's like Congo line, and it's almost like making music. And you did really well. You fitted right in there. It was Zane and yourself as perhaps the only non-East Africans there, and you guys did great. Yeah,
I think those drills are really fascinating because it's kind of all about building up rhythm before you start training. So that was one of the things I found quite difficult, was learning to synchronize my own movements with everyone else's, because that's kind of the point of it, is to, and you kind of, when you listen to it, it sounds like just one person doing drills and then one foot hitting the ground, and then you look and it's actually this whole group of like 50 people, and they're completely in sync with each other. It's really remarkable. Zane was better at it than I was. I think he'd spent a bit longer in Ethiopia than me. I had longer to get used to it.
You must have been intimidated the first time you jumped in to try those drills.
Yeah, I mean, people understood that I wasn't really used to it. Most of these guys have been doing that stuff since they were 12, 13 years old. So it's really kind of programmed in for them. I always felt a little bit like a fish out of water trying to keep up. It was always when they transitioned from one movement to another that it would be tricky to know when they were going to do that. Usually someone would click their fingers to signify the change. But if you missed that, then you were doing the wrong thing, bumping into people, sort of things. Yeah,
and it's on the drills before we throw into the discussion. Zane did comment that there is a difference between the Kenyans' approach and the Ethiopians' approach, and that drills are a real staple of the Ethiopian running culture.
Yeah, I think that's something that I definitely noticed when I went to Bikoji, which is kind of where a lot of athletes start their careers, that some days all they did was drills, just an hour of drills, no actual running. And I think that's fascinating, because if you look at the way that someone like Kenanisa Bikila is talked about as being sort of naturally incredibly gifted, and his running form being just beautiful and amazing. And we assume that a lot of people assume that that's kind of natural, that there's something kind of inherent in the way that Ethiopians are kind of put together genetically or whatever that makes people run like that. But actually, if you go to where he comes from, you can see that is down to, years of really patient work of getting those mechanics right. And that's how he's able to run like that. But yeah, I think that's really interesting.
And we do want to explore that, Mike, the myth of natural talent, giftedness that's bestowed on the East Africans, the Ethiopians, and what your observations actually were, your learnings from from time with Ethiopians and coaches around the reality there, that it's not just giftedness. But Mike, you're an associate professor in social anthropology at Durham University there. Can you just outline a little bit about, I've heard you say that anthropology, social is really just deep hanging out with people to try and understand their world. But what took you there, and what did it actually look like, the process to see out of thin air come to light?
I guess I was first interested in sort of running culture more broadly, growing up in the northeast of England, where my running coach when I was a kid was running for Gateshead Harriers in the 80s, when they had people like Brendan Foster and Charlie Spedding and guys who were going to the Olympics and getting medals and stuff. And I would hear him talk about that as just basically a bunch of guys who were training after work, fitting their athletics around their everyday life, but seeing it as completely normal that you would run 100 miles a week and be able to compete at that level, and thinking, well, that's an example of a kind of running culture in the UK context that I thought was really interesting. And then when I was started to study anthropology, I started to think about kind of, Kenyan running, Ethiopian running, what it was that made those particular parts of the world so good. And I realized that most of the time when we talk about kind of East African running, really we're talking about Kenyan running, because people tend to go to Kenya to do research, because Kenyan people, a lot of them speak English, it's the national language, it's a bit more accessible to go to places like Iten. And I felt like people didn't really know what was that much about what was going on in Ethiopia, because you've got to learn Amharic. It's a little bit less easy to work out what's going on. So I thought, I'd go and spend 15 months there, basically trying to work out what it is that makes Ethiopian runners tick, and sort of how somebody who is growing up and seeking to change their lives, which is how they normally describe it through running, try to look at what the world looks like to somebody like that, basically. So that was the idea. I managed to get some funding from the Economic and Social Research Council in the UK to pay for the fieldwork and things. But it was sort of a 5-year process from the beginning of going out to Ethiopia to getting the book finished and written. So,
and the fieldwork, sorry, Mike, also was the backbone for your PhD thesis, right?
Yeah. So I wrote the PhD thesis first, which is much, a bit more anthropological theory and things in there, and then wrote this book, which is much more about kind of my personal journey of being in Ethiopia as well, and what it was like to go there and learn the language and try to keep up with people and that sort of side of things.
Mike, you write about when you arrived in Ethiopia and the directions you were given for your homestay, if you like. And I was laughing out loud because when I got my directions of where to go when I landed in Addis Ababa, I laughed at first and I thought, this is insane. Addis Ababa maybe is a city of how many million people?
I'm not sure actually, but it's good, probably 10 million, something like that. 10
million. And my directions were get the driver to take you up the mountain, go down this street, knock on, it was just very like abstract. He'll know where to go was the reassurance. I didn't feel so reassured. You had a similar experience, if not.
Did the driver know where to go? In
the end, Zane, I think, felt sorry for him, and he came down to meet me at the airport at Addis Ababa. So it took all of the uncertainty away. But you endured it in the middle of the night. Can you just touch on what that initial landing in Ethiopia was like for you?
Yeah, it was just, I hadn't really thought about it too much until I had a text message from the guy I was staying with explaining the directions, and I hadn't really thought about it until I got off the plane and kind of turned my phone back on, and it was 2 a.m, and it basically, the directions were like, get the driver to take you to the French embassy, then go up one road, then turn left at the next cobbled street, and then right, and then get to near the forest, and then knock on a big corrugated iron door. But basic, and then I think it said, he said get the driver to beep his horn or something. Don't get out of the car because there might be hyenas around. Anyway, I got there. It was fine. Yeah. The thing is, the drivers are used to that. There's no addresses or anything. There's no street names. Well, there are some street names, but there are no house numbers or anything. So they're used to getting those kinds of directions. It doesn't faze them.
Yeah, there was your initial observation and participation in Ethiopian culture. Mike, the great Haile Gebrselassie his comments about the book were, through reading this book, you will come to understand that the heart and soul of running are to be found in Ethiopia. Tough question, and we'll explore this in more detail. What is the heart and soul of running that you found in Ethiopia?
Basically, starting with kind of Abebe Bikila when he won the Rome Olympic Marathon, just this sense that there's something like fundamentally Ethiopian about distance running and being successful over, especially the kind of marathon distance. When Bikila won in Rome, he was running barefoot. He was running in the capital of the country that was previously the kind of colonial power in Ethiopia, and he ran barefoot through the middle of a guard of honor of Italian soldiers. That the symbolism of that moment of him going to Italy, which obviously Ethiopia had been at war with at the turn of the century, and then actually, and winning that race in front of the Italians was really significant. And Haile Selassie, who was the emperor of Ethiopia, said, if you can win in Rome, it would be like winning 1,000 times. So basically, he comes back from Rome, having won that, and he's just this enormous hero. And I think the culture really starts from there. And I think one of the really fascinating things about it is that it's, he was coached by a Swedish army major who was brought to Ethiopia to basically train up the imperial bodyguard of Haile Selassie. There hasn't been that much sort of foreign influence on Ethiopian running in the same way that there was perhaps in Kenya with the British colonialism. The way that people tell the story is that running is something that is kind of learned from other people. So if you become a runner, it's because you go to the forest with people who are already running, and you kind of learn the process of being an athlete through following in other people's footsteps, very literally in learning how to run through the forests. One of the most striking things about running in Ethiopia is that it's really seen as this collective process that if you're going to be successful, you have to train with other people. It's seen as very much a kind of social endeavor, and I think that's where Gebre Selassie, what Gebre Selassie is getting at, really. I love what he wrote. I think he wrote "Running is Life" as well at the end of that quote, and I think that's a really nice sentiment, basically. But yeah, in the first morning I got to Ethiopia, after that taxi ride that we talked about, I just walked up to the forest, and I wasn't really sure what I was going to do, how I was going to meet people. And I just kind of started jogging on my own. And this train of athletes, maybe 8 or 9 guys who were running past, literally just grabbed me by the arm and sort of inserted me into this single file line of people. And it was like, right, well, I was not sure how easy it was going to be to find people to run with. And it was like, 2 minutes. And people had literally grabbed me, and I was then just kind of already part of the group like that. So that's a good indication of how much it's seen as something that has to be done sort of collectively together.
So there's 2 themes there that I just pick up there, Mike. One is the origins that were planted or seeded with Bikila's win there in Rome in the 1960 Olympics barefooted. And then there's also the group improves together mentality. I've heard you quote that success is achieved collectively with others. It's not a solo pursuit as we typically see it in the West. Mike, the history for a moment, I was intrigued that you share in the book around many people that are students of the sport, of course, know about Abebe's victory in 1960, but there was another runner who was left off the team due to illness. And I believe at the time that you met him, from recollection, he was 92 years of age. And his name, Wamu, I'm not even going to dare try pronounce it, but can you just outline a little bit of this story? Because I think it's a beautiful insight into maybe a forgotten bit of history.
Sure, yeah. Wami Baratu, his name was. Abebe Bikila had never beaten Wami Baratu in a race before the Rome Olympics. And unfortunately, Wami was ill, wasn't able to go. And when they interviewed Bikila about winning, he even said, unfortunately, our champion is at home. Wami wasn't able to go. But yeah, he's just an amazing character. He kind of took me into his house. As I assumed, because 1960 is quite a long time ago, I wasn't sure he would still be around. And when I asked somebody who vaguely knew him, he said, "Yeah, of course he's around. He still runs. He still turns up at the National Cross Country every year, and he's he's almost completely blind now, but he follows his son around the cross country, and he's still even running at sort of 90 something years old. But just an incredible guy. He was also almost deaf, so he was kind of shouting his answers to my questions really, really loudly. But yeah, he kind of. He was also in the Imperial Bodyguard with Bikila, so in that kind of military atmosphere. But he said he used to run from the center of Addis all the way up to Intoto mountain and stuff from the center of town back in the 60s. That was possible to, before the city had been all built up. So he was like, these young athletes today, they don't know what's happened to them with these cars that they can use to get around and stuff. They need to go back to the old school way of doing things where you just ran everywhere. But yeah, he's just an amazing guy. And
it seemed to be that Ethiopian runners know Wami and know of Wami and respect Wami and count him as one of the forefathers of the generational successes.
Yeah, totally. Yeah. So when I was actually there chatting to him, there's a runner who came around just to sort of say hi, and he came in because he saw that we were talking. He came in and he just kissed both of his knees and then left. It's like this sort of paying his respects almost to this guy.
Gosh, amazing. Mike, maybe let's just talk about the Ethiopian approach to what we in the West would term polarized training. 80% of the time steady, 20% of the time hard.
Yeah.
I observed in the very short space of time I was there in Ethiopia, I observed, I'd almost call it a naive, not naive, but naive is not the right word, but just a purity, a simplicity to training and the approach. Just if we're going to run hard, it's going to be hard. If it's going to be easy, it's going to be very easy. And can you outline a little bit of your observations around that? You write at one point that we sometimes run so slowly that the women hurry in to collect dry leaves from the forest floor overtake us. And I think a lot of people in the West have heard about how steady sometimes these East African runs can be, but can you outline a little bit about your observations there?
Yeah. I think, you're definitely right that it's this sense that, you've got 3 extremely hard days. And then basically in order to make those 3 days work for you, you've got to make sure that your easy days are easy enough to make it work. So yeah, complete polarization. I think their harder days are kind of harder than pretty much anyone in the world. And then the easy days, some days we'd be running sort of 10-minute mile pace in the forest. And one of the funny things was that when kind of in 2015, there weren't really any GPS watches in Ethiopia at all, but they were just starting to appear. 1 or 2 athletes had them. And one of the things I thought was fascinating was that rather than using them to just to check that they were going fast enough and things, on the days in the forest, it was like you'd put the watch on and then they'd see how slowly they could run the first kilometer. And sometimes it would be like 8 minutes or something like that for a kilometer. And being able to have the confidence to go that slowly on the easy days, I think is really, really kind of interesting. And that was something that they would also deliberately use the forest for. And I was told, because the forests are actually, and Zane says this in the book, the forests aren't an easy place to run a lot of the time. They're very, very steep, very tightly packed eucalyptus trees. You're constantly at risk of kind of tripping over a rock or a tree root or something like that. But what they said was that by training in environments like that, they could ensure that they weren't going to run too fast, basically. If you were going to go to a road or something for an easy run, you'd get carried away by how easy it was to run. So they deliberately ran in these quite challenging environments to ensure that they were going to be running at a slow, easy pace.
That was a brief observation I had in my time there, where the forest, and I'd love you, Mike, to paint a little bit of a visual of what the forest actually is and means. But yeah. I recall following Zane's feet through a forest run and thinking, Zane, you've gone mad. Why on earth are we running within a 1K square area for 50, 60 minutes? It just seemed ludicrous. And I'm, as a physio, running along thinking, gosh, this is a heightened injury risk, all this change of direction, uneven surfaces. Like, surely we can go and run on a nice dirt road somewhere. So can you just explain the forest, what it actually looks like and feels like?
Yeah, so I think you describe it. My initial reaction to it as well there, with this sense that this feels like quite a dangerous place to run. They would see it in quite opposite terms as the sort of having to run on a camber and having to jump over things and having to constantly change direction. is a way of avoiding the kind of monotony of movement that you get if you go for a run on a road, and therefore it's actually going to prevent you from getting injured. So they would see that in completely opposite terms, which I think is kind of fascinating. But just to give a sense of what the forest itself looks like, it's actually most of those forests have been planted relatively recently with eucalyptus trees, and the reason for that is for firewood. So that's the women that I talked about sort of overtaking us when they were going to collect firewood. So, but they're quite densely packed, and rather than there being kind of one trail that went through the middle of the forest like you might expect to see in Australia or in the UK, what you've got is this network of just crisscrossing footpaths that go between all of the different trees. So it looks like, I suppose viewed from above, it would look like a chessboard or something with all these paths going in different directions. And those footpaths are basically created by runners, just constantly choosing new ways of going in and out of the trees. And as you say, it's great. It's really interesting that when Zane took you for a run, even though with none of his teammates there, presumably, he basically ran in exactly the same way that an Ethiopian athlete would, often doing a sort of 16-kilometer run without going more than about 2K away from where you started. And I think it's, this kind of idea that you can just meander around and make it up as you go along makes it into this almost kind of meditative process for some of the runners. And normally what would happen would be that you'd have a group of sort of 4 or 5 guys who would regularly train together, and they'd alternate who was leading those runs. So you'd also have this sense of like, I mean, for me, I found it quite interesting trying to follow someone in that environment, because you never know what they're going to do. So suddenly Zane's going to kind of turn around a tree and turn back 180 degrees on himself. And it kind of keeps you on your toes in a way that you wouldn't be, I suppose, if you were just going for a run down a road. It's kind of, there's a kind of playful element to it, I think, where you're kind of making it up as you go along and being quite creative with with coming up with the route, I suppose.
And if I wish I had have read your book before I landed, Mike, because I feel I would have had a greater respect and appreciation for some of the training practices, rather than trying to view it sometimes with a critical eye around what's the sense in this.
I think in the book I kind of say there were moments when I got really frustrated with it and was kind of annoyed with these guys for taking me into places that I felt were just, where you're literally like pulling yourself up a bank with your hands with tree roots and stuff. And then I would kind of think afterwards, this guy's run 2:08 for a marathon. Why am I here being like, this guy doesn't know what he's doing? This is actually insane. Like, obviously they know what they're doing. It's just a different kind of expertise than what we are used to, I suppose.
And there's that sense that you write about and convey, Mike, so well in the book about dangerous running, that sense that one of the Amharic, the local dialect's words for a good runner is that they're dangerous. Can you just sort of elaborate on that part of this meandering, steep terrain, running down valleys and uphills with hyenas, is that this is dangerous, going out in the middle of the night, like you beautifully write about on one of the hill repeat not runs. Can you just talk about this element of danger?
Yeah, sure. So basically that's about, I think a lot of people trying to cultivate this sense of being dangerous, like adegenya in Amharic is this idea that you want to be, psychologically, you want to feel like you're kind of dangerous or a risk taker in some respects. So they would also use the word dangerous sometimes to describe very, very high altitude places. So just this sense that it's about doing things that are slightly crazy sometimes, like getting up at 2 a.m. to go and do hill reps, doing things that other people are not necessarily prepared to do, and then you do feel kind of like you can stand on a start line and look around you and think, well, I bet there's no one else here who's been doing hill reps at 2 a.m. and that makes you feel kind of a sense of power, or like you've done something that someone else isn't prepared to do. And I think that gives people a particular sort of psychological advantage in some sense. And people would also use the word dangerous to describe someone who was like able to finish a race really, really fast as well. And that was something that people would cultivate that all the time. Even though, so when we were talking about kind of this separation between easy running and hard running, there's also the sense that a very, very easy run in the forest was often followed by really, really fast strides as well. So they've also got the separation of the two kind of intensities within the one training run. And the logic behind that was that you never want to lose your speed. That speed is something that you've got to kind of keep topping up all the time if you want to be able to kind of, to live with the last sort of few hundred meters of a race, basically.
And that notion of, as you put in the book, Mike, an emphasis on these marginal gains, doing tough things. Zane quoted in his episode in 203, which we recorded from Saluda, being comfortable with the uncomfortable. It spills over to some recovery practices. I recall coming home and Zane putting freezing cold water on himself at altitude after a hard session, and he had the option to have a hot shower, but he rejected that. He said, why would I do that? And I know that's sort of an adopted mindset from his time there in East Africa. You had some experiences with that as well, Mike, right? Freezing water and dunking that over your head.
Yeah, plenty of cold showers. And actually, there's someone who I quote in the book who this is at a training camp like very high up in Gondar, where it's even higher than Sululta, sort of 3,000 meters above sea level. He came back from a run and it was freezing. It was like 1 degree, and he just took all his kit off and got this massive bucket of freezing water and poured it on himself. And I was like, "What are you doing?" And I was like, "Are you not cold?" And he said, "No, I'm not cold. I'm a very dangerous man." That's what he said. So it's like, it's exactly that of just being. Embracing the discomfort. And I think it almost, some of those things like getting up at 2 a.m. to go and run up and down a hill, it's almost like a maximal gain rather than a minimal gain, like a minimal gain. I think it's like seen as something a bit dramatic that you do occasionally to kind of provide an extra sort of stimulus, but you wouldn't necessarily do that all the time. And they do some of the marginal gain stuff as well, like making sure that they get plenty of sleep and all that kind of thing. They are doing that stuff, but occasionally they'll do something a little bit crazy to just kind of liven things up a bit.
You're listening to Assistant Professor in Social Anthropology, Dr. Mike Crawley, on this expert edition around all things Ethiopian running culture. Support for today's show comes from Earshot's Bluetooth headphones. These are headphones for not anyone, but simply for runners and cyclists who charge. Now, if you are sick of your headphones falling out of your ears, or like me, sick of your headphones going flat on long training sessions, then Earshot's headphones should become your headphone of choice. Co-founder and CEO James Bell Booth became frustrated by the constant distractions of his own headphones dislodging and falling out, and forged in New Zealand's national parks, Earshot's Bluetooth headphones were born. Now, the team are offering up 10% off your very own pair of Earshot's Bluetooth headphones, normally retailing at $169.75, by simply using the code TPPS at checkout. That's TPPS for 10% off your very own Earshot's headphones. Support for today's show also comes from Pogo Physio's very own telehealth consultations. If you are a runner, triathlete, or endurance athlete frustrated by bone, tendon, or joint-related concerns, then rest assured our online telehealth consultations, which have been used effectively even pre-pandemic times, can be a sound way of getting a great outcome and back to your physical best. You can jump online to pogophysio.com.au/telehealth to schedule your 45-minute online telehealth consultation with myself or any of the Pogo Physio team. And here's a great successful case study from Tasmanian-based, recreationally competitive triathlete Sarah Hardy around Sarah's own experiences in getting back to a physical best via telehealth.
Hey, I'm Sarah. I'm a competitive age group triathlete from Australia, and telehealth 100% works. I did telehealth with Brad for chronic sesamoiditis, and I didn't need any hands-on treatment. I had exercise prescription and load management with my training. And this, along with Brad's expertise and genuine care, got me across my Pogo finish line.
And of course, today's episode is brought to you by the Physical Performance Show's very own Learnings membership. It's simple. If you'd like to support the production of the show, you can do so from just $5 per month, and in return, we'll grant you access to our back catalogue of live stream events featuring Dr. Shona Halson on all things optimal recovery and Dr. Stephen Seiler on all things polarized training. These events are normally ticketed at $49 per head, but for our Patreon members, we'll share those with you as a little thank you. What's more, our upcoming 2021 live stream events will be complimentary for our Patreon supporters as well. We have a great lineup this year, with dates soon to be confirmed, featuring UK-based sports dietitian Rinny McGregor, who will conduct a live stream on all things fueling for endurance athletes, and Australian-based positive psychology researcher Rory Darkins, who will be hosting a live stream in late 2021. Now, massive thanks to our new patrons for your support. Bupi Takar, who you can find over on Instagram at Bupinda Takar, BHUPINDER_THAKUR. Big thanks also to long-term show supporter and certainly an encourager of myself over the years in producing the show, Jürgen Foley, Swiss-based triathlete and super coach. You'll find Jürgen on Instagram at coach_Jürgen Leo Foley, JURGENLEOFOLEY, coach_Jürgen Leo Foley. And lastly, thank you also to Julian Tubman, Brisbane-based physiotherapist and triathlete, for your support via Patreon as well. All right, gang, time to jump back with this week's featured guest on this expert edition, Assistant Professor, Social Anthropology, Mike Crawley, on all things the running wisdom and magic from above the clouds in Ethiopia. Mike, the recovery side of things, what did you learn from the recovery side of things? My brief observation was probably twofold. They sleep a lot and they walk very slowly.
Yeah, definitely. And they sleep a lot, but I felt like there wasn't that much anxiety around sleep. So it wasn't like everyone was going off to have a nap on their own for exactly 2 hours at the right sort of time of day. It was usually that there'd be like a bunch of guys around, and at some point, you'd be sitting around listening to music videos or whatever, and then somebody would just sort of pull a blanket over their head in a room full of other people and just like have a little bit of a sleep. And so people weren't like really worried about getting a certain number of hours of sleep or anything, but it was very much like, if you're not running, you ought to be doing as little as you could. So people would use the word laps, zur in Amharic, to describe like going around doing errands or going to meet someone at a cafe or something like that. They describe that as doing laps. And that was something that, you shouldn't really be doing. Doing laps was for on the athletics track and nowhere else. If you're at home, you should just be chilling out, basically. So they definitely believed in that stuff. I felt like around nutrition, we often think that it's really important to have some food within 20 minutes of finishing a session, talk about kind of the 20-minute window, that kind of stuff. We would never hit that 20-minute window because we'd always be in the bus on the way back from training, sometimes for like 2 hours after a long run. So you'd sometimes, and I write about this in the book, but one day we ran like 30K in the morning, and we got up at about 5 o'clock, ran 30K, drove back into Addis, got back at maybe 11 o'clock, and the guys realized that there was some 10,000 meter races happening in the stadium. So we went straight to the stadium, sat and watched these 10,000 meter races in the like really hot midday sun. And we still hadn't eaten anything since the night before. And I was like getting kind of pretty woozy at that stage, and no one else seemed that bothered. And then eventually we went for lunch. But it was, there wasn't, I think we maybe over obsess over some of the little things, I guess, in the West, and maybe don't do some of the big things as well as we could.
Yeah, but there is some stark contrasts, and one of the runners, Jamal, am I pronouncing Jamal's Yamar?
Yeah.
The one of the best half marathoners on the planet, sub 60 numerous times, and he was at that track session that Sunday morning. That he finished a hard workout and was known to have 6 to 10 juices, nothing solid, but just different types of juice.
Yeah. So, the juice places are amazing in Ethiopia. They're like just a great place to hang out. But yeah, he just had like, I mean, two of the juices were probably avocado juice. So like you got maybe like 6 avocados in each of those. So it's pretty nutritious, but no carbs, no bread or anything like that. And then he was going to go to sleep and then go for another run in the afternoon. But yeah, I wonder as well because most of the runners I knew were Orthodox Christians, and they also fast a huge number of days of the year where they basically eat only vegan food, and a lot of them don't eat anything until 3 o'clock in the afternoon on those days. So they're kind of used to going without food for decent chunks of the day, and also performing at that kind of high level. And I don't know whether whether there's any sense that actually might help in the last few kilometers of a marathon if your body's used to that kind of thing. But I don't think that wasn't kind of the logic behind it. It was just the way that people approach food for kind of religious reasons as well.
One thing I was surprised with, Mike, was the food was so fresh. I grew up in the 90s here in Australia, and televised felt like all the time the Ethiopian famine, and I was a little bit mindful that I might encounter a lack of food, and not for myself personally, but observe it and how would I process that? But I actually left Ethiopia feeling like, you know what, they've actually probably got it down pat pretty darn well compared to the West in many ways. What were your observations around
diet-wise?
Food?
Yeah, I mean, it was interesting in Bokoji, where I went, the place where Hyenas Bikila and loads of other people are from. I remember talking to some guys who had not yet moved to Addis to join clubs in Addis Ababa. And one of the things they were worried about moving to the city was that it's some of the kind of farmsteads where they'd grown up, they'd never actually eaten anything that was grown outside of kind of where they could see. So they everything was grown basically on the land, either on their own land or their neighbour's land, and they were kind of very much of the opinion that eating kind of locally sourced organic food was really important. So they were worried about coming to Addis and then sort of getting used to eating pasta and stuff like that. But I think, I don't know if you ate much injera when you were in Ethiopia, but the sort of staple bread is also really nutritious. It's made of teff, which is very high protein grain. It's very high in iron. So I don't think there's actually, I remember talking to a nutritionist actually about a sports nutritionist who said, it'd be fascinating to go and actually do some analysis of the food, of the diet. I don't think anyone's done that yet. So maybe at some point that will happen.
Yeah, absolutely. I think injera was a distinctive taste, that's for sure. A couple of things there, Mike, and you write so well about these throughout Out of Thin Air, but one is the Ethiopian running culture's fascination with running surfaces. You've touched on the forest, altitude, but the surfaces, Jamal Yima, 58, what is he, 58.23 or something, Mike?
58.33, I think, yeah.
58.33 half marathoner, just moves beautifully. Before he set that time in Valencia, he only ran on the road, you document in the book, twice.
Yeah.
So, what did you there's the gravel runs, I'm going to mispronounce the word, Koronoch. Can you help me here, Mike? Korokonch. Yeah. So just a little bit on the surfaces, what did you pick up there?
Yeah, sure. Basically what people would say was that you want to avoid running on the road as much as possible. So that even the top marathon runners trained on the road once per week on a Friday morning. And our group trained on a Friday morning. And then the rest of the runs, you want to avoid the road as much as possible. It was seen as a surface that was far too hard to run on. And the way that people described it was that it would kill your speed by just deadening your legs if you ran too much on the road. So there was this in kind of rural training camps up in the north of Ethiopia, where people are training for kind of 5,000 and 10,000 meters. People wouldn't go anywhere near a road when they were training. It was all grass, usually grass tracks, hill reps in the forests, and then this Korokonch surface, which Korokonch is a word in Amharic which describes a kind of gravel, a sort of rough road surface, and the word is like that because it just basically makes the same sound as the noise that your feet make if you're running on gravel. Korokonch. But yeah, so we'd run on Korokonch on a Monday morning, we'd do a grass speed session on a Wednesday morning, and we'd run on the road on a Friday morning, and the rest of the time we'd be basically in the forest on very soft surfaces. So there was this sense really that you had to kind of get the right balance between different surfaces in order to get good, and you also had to get the balance between the right kind of sort of environments more broadly as well. So they'd be thinking about the surface underfoot, but they'd also be thinking about the altitude of different places throughout the week. So you'd want to have, if you're in a base training phase, you'd be trying to get up really high altitude more often. If you were focusing on speed, they would drive down to a place called Akaki, which was sort of only about 2,000 meters above sea level, maybe 15 degrees warmer than, for example, the mountain. So there was this, that people did spend a lot of time compared with Kenya, where most people just get up and go out of their front door and they're able to start running. Ethiopian athletes spend a lot of time driving to very particular places for like particular training reasons, basically.
And that made me, it felt like it was intentional. there was always intention. I feel in the West, it's easy just to concentrate on accumulating miles, but it seemed like there was always an intentionality around, as you say, location for running, type of session, who you were running with, etc. The altitude, Mike, one of my most loved pages of Out of Thin Air is the little map that you have at the front of the book, where it's just a nice little bit of a Lord of the Rings style map, and you can sort of visualize where these locations are that you visit and you write about through the book. But can you just touch on some of these? You term them mysterious, incalculable forces that the Ethiopian runners bestow upon altitude running in the forest.
Yeah, so I think like in Toto is somewhere that people always said that you had to go, which is basically the mountain that you would have driven over to get to Sululta. And that was because of the altitude to a certain extent. So, obviously a sports physiologist would say there's a real logic to going to train there because thinner air, increase of red blood cells, all that kind of stuff. But it wasn't just that. It was also because it was the place where Haile Gebrselassie famously trained every morning. It was also somewhere where there were like a number of Orthodox churches on the mountain that people would run between. So it was seen as having this power that went beyond just the altitude, I guess. And it's something that actually Ryan Hall, who obviously trained in Ethiopia a lot, he said that was his favorite place to run because of the churches up there and because he felt really close to God because it was so high altitude. So, it's not just it wasn't just Ethiopians who attached this kind of special power to it. It was also people like Ryan who obviously, felt a kind of pull there as well. And
one of the other signatures of Ethiopian running, you touched on the dangerous side of sometimes these marginal gain sessions, is the encounters with hyenas. Whenever it falls dark, the hyenas come out. You can hear them. Certainly I could in Mizan there in the village. You can hear them outside all night. And you go out early in the morning or late at night, and yes, you're likely to encounter them. I think I had several encounters in a short space of time over there, which was a real eye-opener. You had some great encounters, and there was this particular run that you write about, Mike, before you finished up your stay there, where you're a little bit nervous about going through I think it was a sheep farm, where some of your running guides, Faisal, and they had an encounter. Can you just share around that? Because that was brilliant.
Yeah, so this was one of the times when we went out running at 2:00 in the morning, which is something that people sometimes do because you can run actually in Addis Ababa itself, around the city without very much traffic. But yeah, the slight problem with that is that sometimes you will encounter hyenas who've come down into the city to kind of clear up the kind of the sheep farm or where the market, basically, where there's bits of sheep skins and things hanging around. And Haile described basically running into the middle of a group of hyenas by accident with Faisal at one point. And they just were kind of surrounded, didn't really know what to do. And I think Haile said, we just stay as still as you can. And we just hope that a car comes along. And if a car does come along, we just absolutely leg it with the car as fast as we can and hope that the hyenas scatter. And that's basically what happened. But yeah, we saw, you'd see hyenas quite a lot. Sometimes in the forest runs, people would go deliberately looking for where the hyenas were just to kind of have something to do, I suppose. I never really felt like I was in danger from the hyenas when I was there. I think it was just, kind of interesting that they were around. And what Haile said was that basically the hyenas are like people. Most of them are fine. Very occasionally you get a crazy one. And if you happen to encounter that crazy one, then you're in trouble, but usually they were fine.
And I mean, they burrow underground, right?
Yeah, they're much bigger than I thought they were. I don't know if you found that, but quite big things.
Yeah, ugly, very ugly too.
Yeah.
And certainly when you first have your first encounter, you pick up your pace, you forget about intensity, discipline at that point. Mike, what were the key constituents of an Ethiopian running week in sessions? You've touched on it, the easy stuff, but what were the general themes?
Sure. So basically pretty much everyone I knew took Sundays completely off. So Sunday was a rest day. And then on Monday we would go to Korokonch Road, this kind of rough road, usually kind of an undulating rough road, and do usually like a long run starting quite slowly and ending quite fast. So you'd be looking at maybe 30K, starting out at like just over 4 minutes per kilometre and ending up at sort of 3:20, something like that. So that long run would kind of vary depending on whether people were running half marathon or marathon, but you pretty much always a long run on a Monday morning. Then a Wednesday morning would normally be a speed session, but quite often quite an informal speed session. So like something like 1 minute, 2 minutes, 3 minutes with equal recovery, with reps adding up to like maybe 36 minutes, something like that. And they would often be run, always with the group, and usually quite often around that big field that you would have seen at Satellite up in Salulta. So just like a big open field, and people would, quite often not even be told what route to run around the field. So it would just be whoever was leading would just like pick a route, and everyone would follow them. And so that on the Wednesday would normally be the one session of the week where people were allowed to really kind of have a go at each other and compete in the reps, and kind of test each other. And then on the Friday morning, it would be, as I said, like asphalt training, as they called it. So like on a road somewhere, and it would be either kind of just a tempo run of 20K or 25K, running pretty hard, or things like 2K hard, 1K floats, adding up to 20K, something like that. So with the 2K hard bit being run at about 3 minutes per kilometre, and then the easy bit being run at sort of 3:30 per kilometre, something like that. So running at 2:06 marathon pace at that kind of altitude. So basically for me as an anthropologist, I was able to, I was kind of committed to trying to do as much running with people as I could in order to be able to write about it. But a session like that, I was just out the back door immediately. I just couldn't live with that. I mean, Zane obviously can, which is incredible, but there's no way I could live with that kind of session. And then, as I said, loads of running in the forest around. The bulk of the mileage just made up in the forests around that.
Just steady, yeah. And hill repeats, Mike, you cite in the book that there's two types: the longer hills, and then the shorter ones. Yeah, a little bit on that, Mike. Anything you'd elaborate?
Yeah, sure. The long hill session, I think, is something that it's quite similar to something that people do in Kenya as well, where you get quite a long hill, maybe 400 meters long, something like that, but it's not too steep, and it's not a flat out rep up and then a jog back, but it's sort of you're running kind of steady up the hill and then steady back down again, and it would always be pretty much always for an hour continuous effort. Rather than counting the number of reps or anything. But I feel like, usually when I've done hill sessions in the UK, it's been like you find a hill and you get to the top of it as quick as you can, and then you jog slowly back down. This was more like a, continuous effort up and down the hill for a set amount of time. And often at 2 a.m, so that we could ensure that the road was completely free of people. But we'd often do short hill reps after easy runs, actually. So like sort of 80-meter sprinting sort of hills. And usually the short hills would be something that would be tagged on to a larger session, as opposed to like a separate session like the long hills were.
Yeah, so there's that variation. Hill running isn't just hill running. Mike, what were your observations around strength and conditioning? Obviously, it's quite a big part in the Western running world. I found it interesting because it's indoctrinated that heavy resistance work is key for building tissue capacity. It's one of the approaches we take, certainly as physios working with runners in the West. Yet in Ethiopia, Zane at one point, I handed him a dumbbell in the gym and he said, "Bro, don't you know I don't run with my arms?" So there was this real reluctance to pick up anything. Mind you, he would engage in some heavy resistance work, lower limbs and compound lifts. But what were your observations there, Mike, with the group?
So the guys I spent most of my time with were kind of on the edge of being sort of world-class marathon runners. They were kind of, the agent whose athletes I was mainly training with described it as kind of a development group. So they were mainly like between 2:08 and maybe 2:12 marathon runners. I feel like the very top guys, the guys who are running 2:03, 2:04, they are going to the gym quite a bit. But not usually to do heavy weights or anything, but just doing some stuff in the gym. The guys I knew weren't doing anything in the gym. They were doing sit-ups, press-ups, core stability work after runs sometimes. But that was really the extent of that kind of thing that they were doing. And then we'd always have a period in the rainy season, so it was sort of like August time, where they would really decrease the amount of training that people were doing running wise, but we'd do a lot more kind of plyometrics and body weight strength exercises. But they'd be kind of just on a field up in Toto or something like that. It would very rarely be in a gym. So yeah, I don't think many Ethiopian athletes are lifting weights at all, really.
Yeah, which is counterintuitive to what we might assume here in the West. One thing that is a stark difference, another thing that's a stark difference, Mike, and you write about it in the book, is the institutional support for distance running development in Ethiopia. Can you just outline briefly how the system works?
Yeah, that was one thing that kind of surprised me quite a lot, actually, and I think because of the kinds of stereotypes that you normally encounter around East African running as being, the kind of thing that commentators usually pick up on is, Kenyan and Ethiopian runners, they're good because they run to school or because of kind of various things that seem quite natural or like part of everyday life. But actually, there's a huge amount of institutional support, as you say. So basically, lots of training camps in rural areas that are funded by the government, which include the one that I stayed in when I went up to Gondar to do some research up there, where you've got kind of like an army-style barracks in the middle of the countryside, and some coaches and a running track that they've kind of marked out themselves on the grass, and that's funded by the government, and people are provided with somewhere to live and provided with food and a small stipend to live on. And you've maybe got 100 people in that camp and 100 camps like that in the area. And then you have regional competitions every 6 months or something. And from them, you're going to find some really talented athletes, basically. And then they make it move towards kind of more regional clubs. And then once you get to Addis Ababa itself, you've got a whole load of first division and second division clubs, which are first division clubs are sponsored by organizations like the Ethiopian Commercial Bank or the kind of prison service, or a lot of the guys I knew ran for the Electricity Corporation, and they're paid salaries basically to represent the Electricity Corporation in domestic races. So it's a bit more like almost like the Japanese corporate teams actually in some way. But yeah, just basically hundreds of people who have paid enough money to just be full-time runners. And I think that's a factor that is normally overlooked when we try to think about why Ethiopians and Kenyans are so good. And I think that's less of the case in Kenya, but in Ethiopia, there's a lot of people who are supported by the government. So
it really puts the sword to the myth of the natural Ethiopian runner that grew up succeeding because they ran to school barefooted.
Yeah, I mean, and some people did run to school barefooted, and people like what people would say is that the vast majority of top Ethiopian athletes grew up on farms and had to do a reasonable amount of physical labor every day as part of that, whether that was going out to herd some sheep for the day, or whether that was lifting stuff or like helping to plow fields or whatever it was. They basically said, the average person who starts running is a lot stronger than the equivalent aged person who's grown up in a city and is mainly sitting behind a desk at a school or whatever. So they bought into this idea that there was the kind of more natural, if you want to call it that, upbringing did make them successful in that it built a foundation to build upon when they started training properly. But yeah, I think there are definitely other factors as well that influence what's going on.
You're right that Abebe Bikila's coach did actually comment about his school situation growing up. I thought it was quite amusing.
Yeah. So I was talking to him about that, and he was like, well, yeah, Kenanisa's house is over there at one side of the square, and the school's just over there. So he wasn't having to run very far to get to school.
You're listening to Assistant Professor, Social Anthropology, Dr. Mike Crawley, sharing around his recent publication, Out of Thin Air, Running Wisdom and Magic from Above the Clouds in Ethiopia, on this expert edition. If you missed last week's episode, it has been a very popular episode featuring return guest, now 3 times, of the show, Eloise Wellins. And it was the final episode in a 4-part series exploring postpartum return to sport. It started with US-based sports medicine specialist Celeste Goodson, was followed by Australian athletics representatives Victoria Mitchell, Jessica Stenson, and of course, Eloise. Here's a little snippet from my conversation with Eloise on last week's episode. What would your top tip be to women looking to return to running postpartum be?
One top tip would just be don't rush. Don't rush your comeback. Like just a really logical progression. I know you said one top tip, but this is all kind of interlinked. I feel like the comparison thing is a big thing, especially with social media. You can look at other women or other female athletes that are, ahead of you, and they had their baby after you, and you just can't even go there in your mind. You are on your own journey. Stay in your own lane.
If you missed Eloise's sharings last week, be sure to jump back wherever it is that you enjoy your podcast from. Peruse the archives whilst there, dating right back to episode 1, featuring surf life-saving Ironman champion Ali Day. For now, let's jump back with this week's featured guest on this expert edition, Dr. Mike Crawley, social anthropologist, exploring the running wisdom and magic from above the clouds in Ethiopia, the subtitle of his recently published book, Out of Thin Air. Mike, you've been very generous with your time, and just to try and squeeze out some consolidated thoughts from you, I'm going to challenge you with a few questions here. The first one being, if you could summarise Ethiopian running culture in one word, what would that word be, Mike?
I think I'd say committed. I think, most of the guys that I knew, they said, you can't be a runner and have another job, or you'll be too worried about anything else apart from running. If you're a runner, that's what you do and it's what you focus on. So I'd go with committed on that one. Committed.
Mike, in translating the pages of Out of Thin Air, which is just a book that any runners are a special breed and they speak their own language and they're very different. And I can't imagine any runner that would not lose themselves for 5, 6, 7 hours to get through these pages. It's just full of great stories. But in translating some of the practical takeaways, Mike, we talk about the learnings of this show into 3 learnings to help runners run at their best. What would Dr. Mike Crawley's top 3 tips be based on Ethiopian running? This is hard, I know.
I think the first one would probably be sort of keep it as creative and interesting as possible. I think we often think about high performance sport as being as kind of having the joy sucked out of it a little bit by constantly trying to measure it and strip things down to being as effective as possible. What I learned in Ethiopia was that even world-class marathon runners in Ethiopia are trying as hard as they can to make this a creative process and keep it as interesting as possible. So try and be innovative in coming up with new running routes, new ways of doing your training. Just basically try and keep it enjoyable. I'd say, get off the roads as much as possible. So one of the surprising things which you talked about already is that for most of these top marathon runners in the world, their training day to day actually more closely resembles what we describe as trail running. Try to mix it up a bit more in that way. And then just never neglect your speed. I think there's if there's one thing that you see quite often, it's an Ethiopian athlete sort of who you've hardly noticed, who's been following a group of Kenyans or whatever for most of a race, and then they just unleash this like ferocious finish in the last 100 meters. That's because pretty much every run is finished off with 6 flat out strides in Ethiopia. Even some of the times when we'd run sort of for 2.5 hours or something, they would still do some strides afterwards. So just don't neglect the speed, I guess. The third one.
Brilliant. So number 1, keep things creative, interesting, enjoyable, stay innovative. 2, get off the roads. 3, never neglect your speed. An example practically being incorporate some strides at the end of every run. I know when Mo Farah was out there in Saluda at the time, you were there, I was there, and the satellite field was one of his favourite, running spots. And it's just quite an unattractive grass field with big fences along it. And you think these runners could run anywhere in the world in the most pristine environments, and they're running loops around this field.
He talks about running laps and laps around, he's quite happy running a 20-mile long run round a 1-mile loop, though. He's talked about that before. He's a bit of a, just unusual character in some ways.
Mike, every guest of the show issues listeners with a physical challenge for the week. So I'm fascinated to find out, it'll be fascinating, I should say, to find out what Dr. Mike Crawley's physical challenge is going to be.
I would say, try one of these zigzag style runs that I talk about in the book. So go, find a little bit of forest or a big field or something, and just kind of, rather than, I think we normally, what we do is we just run laps of somewhere like that, or we find an easy trail, but instead kind of take a more kind of meandering approach where you kind of go back on yourself and zigzag around and just try to come up with a route that's a little bit more interesting. Like, as you said with Zane, he could run for an hour in a 1 kilometer space, and to have a go at seeing if you can do that, and how it changes your attitude to running and makes it a bit different, I guess.
And I'm curious to know, Mike, back there in the UK, have you gone back to typical loop running or out and back running, or are you still predominantly incorporating some of these Ethiopian practices yourself with your very handy running?
It's a bit of both, actually. So my head of department in Durham also does quite a lot of running, and she always takes the mick out of me because my Strava can get quite boring, because I do quite like an out and back run on. I like to run on a surface that's a bit like the Korokonch in Ethiopia. There's a really great gravel railway path that I like to run on. But yeah, I also do quite a lot in the forests around. We've got a really good set of forests next to the university sports field, so I do a bit of zigzag running still. But I find it can be a little bit more difficult to fit that kind of thing in when you've got a very tight working schedule and limited amount of time to run. So training has been this year especially has been quite difficult to fit in. So it's been more about kind of trying to get in an hour as fast as I can when I can.
Yeah, I mean, I'm incorporating one. I call it my Ethiopian run per week, where it's a local park and I'm just running around through trees. And I'm sure people think there's something wrong, but it's nice to mix it up.
I get people sending me them on like screenshots of their Strava runs where they're recreating some of the stuff. It's great to see that.
Well, I think that's something that we must do. If you are tuning in and you want to send Mike or tag Mike in, we can find you, Mike, on Instagram at Mike Crawl. The book's available wherever books are sold, online, local distributors, except local bookshops, etc. And congratulations on the nomination, the long listing for the Royal Society of Literature, which is awarded to a distinguished work of fiction, non-fiction or poetry evoking the spirit of a place. That's fair acknowledgement of what's gone into putting this book together, Mike. So congrats.
Yeah, thanks. Yeah, I was proud of that one because it's not related to sport. It's just about kind of evoking a place, as you say. So yeah, pleased with that.
Mike, and the book, as I said, is available. Where can people find you other than Instagram? Anywhere else, or that's the main place you direct people to?
I'm on
Mike?
Twitter at MPH Crawley as well.
And Strava, we can find you there as well.
I'm on Strava. I think if you just search Michael Crawley, I should come up. There's not been much on there recently. I'm currently going from injury to injury, so hopefully be back soon though.
You need a bit more time zigzagging, Mike, a little bit less out and back.
Exactly, yeah. Now, I'll tell you what it was. It was the transition from being in lockdown and there being no races and just kind of ticking over a little bit to suddenly getting a half marathon opportunity with like 2 weeks to spare and just trying to ramp up the training too much as a result of that. So that's what did it. But
cramming.
Be back. Yeah, exactly.
Well, Mike Crawley, once again, thank you for your generosity in sharing, and we all must pick up a copy of Out of Thin Air. It is just an outstanding publication. So congratulations and thanks again for sharing.
Thank you very much. Really enjoyed it.
So there you have it, another episode of The Physical Performance Show, and I trust and I know you enjoyed Dr. Mike's share-ins. What a fantastic and fun insight into the world of Ethiopian running. Now, I was very privileged to spend time out there in February in 2020 at altitude with former guest of the show on episode 203, Zane Robertson, New Zealand half and full marathon record holder. And I can assure you it is a fascinating culture, one that, as Dr. Mike has shared around, we know very little about in the West. And I'm sure, like myself, your prior held theories around the mythical East African runner running to school barefoot, genetically gifted, born to run, have been somewhat dashed. As Dr. Mike outlined, it was Abebe Bikila's 1960 victory in the marathon in the Rome Olympics that really gave birth to this strong running culture and performance heritage of Ethiopian running. Now, if you are yet to pick up your copy of Out of Thin Air, do not delay. It is one of the best reads I have had in years. One of those books that you do not want to stop turning the pages of. It's available wherever you get your books, as you heard Dr. Mike share. And it's also a great gift for any runner or athlete in your world. Jump over, do let Dr. Mike know on social media what it was that you enjoyed from his sharings, or tag Dr. Mike and the Physical Performance Show in on your next zigzag run on Strava. You'll find the show at Physical Performance Show, and you'll find Mike at Mike Crawley. Massive thanks to the folk who make this show possible each and every week. Daryl Misson, our audio engineer, Susan Wilkin on all things show administration, and Matthew Olding on all things show graphic design. Another huge thank you to Earshot's Bluetooth headphones. If you're looking to upgrade your headphones, then don't delay. Use the code TPPS for 10% off at the checkout and get your earphones sorted. No more flat batteries and no more dislodging from your earbuds. Once again, thanks to those who are supporting the show through Patreon. Your support is very greatly appreciated and makes a very practical difference. If you'd like to jump over and support the show, simply search the Physical Performance Show over at patreon.com, and from there we'll grant you access to our back catalogue of live stream events and our upcoming live stream events for 2021, normally ticketed at $49 per person per event. If you're stuck with a bone, tendon or joint related concern and would like help, you are welcome to contact me, b.beer@pogophysio.com.au, or jump over to pogophysio.com.au/telehealth for your online 45-minute consultation. Now, coming up on next week's episode of the Physical Performance Show, we keep the learnings coming your way. And I was thrilled to have the opportunity to catch up with Head of Performance of Bahrain McLaren Professional Cycling Team, Dr. David Bailey, for a deep dive into all things high performance in endurance sports and the concept of maximal versus marginal gains. There is very little that David Bailey has not been exposed to in his 15-year career in high performance and exercise physiology. Prior to his role at Team Bahrain McLaren, David was a head of performance at BMC Racing Team, guiding cyclists such as Australia's Richie Porte and Rowan Dennis. And prior to that, David worked as a senior physiologist for the English Institute of Sport with both Olympic triathlon and cycling programs. He's a wealth of knowledge, so be sure to be tuning in to next week's episode of the Physical Performance Show. Until then, keep pursuing your physical best performance. I'm Brad Beer, and this has been the Physical Performance Show.